So we're here, Gene Nelson and George the son, and I've got some letters from Midland, University of Midland's alumni. We were at the choir alumni concert in April, and Dad came and had his tux and tails and did a great job. So I asked folks if they would send a letter, that I would read it to Dad, and he can respond to your reminiscing about the good old days. So here's one from David Pinkle. Hello, George. Well, I could write a book about your dad, but I will share some moments that were pretty special for me. Some of these probably don't need to go public, see number 1, but will hopefully be fun for Gene to recall. His impact on my life has been immense, and as music continues to be a huge part of my life, I often reflect on my days in the Midland Choir and the Cleft Dwellers, and how those experiences will be carried with me to my final days. Number 1. I'm going to say it anyway, David, sorry. As a young, scared freshman at Midland, and supposing to be a basketball player rather than a singer, I went ahead and auditioned for the choir anyway, scared to death of that larger-than-life director. Well, I passed the audition, and Gene summoned me to his office and took me into the back reaches of the robe storage area to fit me for a robe. Now I was really scared to be alone with this sophisticated man of distinction. Whereon he lifted his leg, cut a huge fart, and said to me, "Oops, speak to me, sweet lips." My life changed forever. He was kind of like me. Number 2. Basketball season came around, and I had to go play basketball and was unable to continue in the choir. Every day I'd walk by the Clemens Hall and I could hear the choir rehearsing. I was being torn apart. Dark days. Number 3. At the conclusion of basketball season, Gene came to me and asked me to rejoin the choir and go on the choir tour. I worked hard to learn the music and was a late addition to the choir, which toured Nebraska and Colorado that year. Among all the fun of being on tour with other young people, and boy, I probably had too much fun, I was captivated by the experience of singing all those performances with Gene on the podium. I've said this before and will say it to my dying day. When Gene Nelson strode up the aisle and took his place on the podium, it was like magic. There were sparks in the air and we sang our hearts out. Oh yes, and when we closed our performances with Beautiful Savior, it was the most wonderful feeling of oneness that I have ever experienced. At one with all our voices, at one with our director, at one with our audience, and at one with our Creator and Savior. For me, it was a mountaintop experience that I will always carry with me. Number 4. On my very first choir tour, we performed a concert in Wheat Ridge, Colorado. A large metal cross was suspended by wire above the chancel. When we cut off the final chord of a particularly emotional performance of Beautiful Savior at the conclusion of our concert, actually all of our performances of that piece were quite emotional, the cross above us rang like a tuning fork. We apparently caught the resonating frequency of the cross. That's the physics part of it, but it was an unbelievable occurrence, and I've been told to this day it's never happened again. How do you explain something like that? Number 5. Long, painful story made short. In the spring of my freshman year after the choir tour, I wrestled with the decision about basketball and finally auditioned for the Cleft Dwellers, thinking that if I made it, I would give up basketball. Well, I did, and the die was cast. I gave up basketball for choir. Here's the fun part, for me, but probably not for Gene. Gene had played in a weekly card group with then basketball coach Mai Dramel. I'm told that Mai was so upset with Gene for stealing one of his players that he would no longer play cards with Gene. Perhaps that's just an urban legend, but that's what I've been told. Note, I was not a great basketball player, but Mai just didn't like losing to Gene. You remember that?
I don't remember.
Okay, maybe that's the urban legend. Number 6. My sophomore year, the choir toured all the way south through Dallas, Houston, and to Brownsville, Texas. In Brownsville, which is on the Mexican border, we were giving a free day, and most of us walked across the border into Matamoros, Mexico. We had a wiener roast on the beach that night, and upon returning to the motel, we learned that Fremont was in the epicenter of a huge blizzard. Too bad. Some of our more enterprising choir members had managed to smuggle bottles of tequila back across the border, and that night we were staying in a motel. Need I say more? Blizzard party. My, what a fun night that was. Number 7. The next day was not so much fun. But I remember best was an angry Gene Nelson striding to the podium for our Austin, Texas performance. We were all pretty scared. And believe me, he really had our attention that night. He directed with a vengeance, and I think that concert was about 15 minutes shorter than most. All things aside, he had a good reason to be angry with us, but after that concert in Austin, it was like all was forgiven, and we continued to have a good tour. He never held a grudge against the offenders, and for that, I was thankful. Number 8, one last memory. After I graduated from Midland, I worked for several years in the admissions office. Gene needed someone to go along on choir tour as the manager, and he somehow convinced our admissions director to let me do that. The tour was to the western United States. We bussed all the way to Reno, Nevada, and then to Lagos, flew back to Grand Junction, Colorado, and then bussed home with more concerts along the way. One of our stops was in Salt Lake City, where we toured the Mormon Tabernacle. I never understood how he managed this, but Gene told the Mormons into allowing the Midland Choir to get into that choir loft and sing several selections. One of the songs was a number I had sung in the choir, so I got to sing with the choir for that piece in the world-famous Mormon Tabernacle. It was a thrill for all the students and for me as well, and I've always marveled that Gene was able to provide that kind of experience for a bunch of kids from a Lutheran college in Nebraska. But that's who Gene Nelson is, a man bigger than life in the eyes of many of us. What do you got to say to Dave Pinkel, Dad?
Oh, Dave. Dave was a blessing. He was a beautiful guy. And I'll tell you, if I could have that many guys in the choir, I would be a lucky, lucky person. He was great. And we wrote a lot of good things. And I'm very happy to put the time on with that kind of a guy. And I hope that someday that he will find the same feelings. He was a wonderful guy.
Thanks, Daddy.
Thank you.
More to come.